from our region. The conveners of this group are the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh and the Jewish Community Legacy Project. JCLP works exclusively with small congregations around the country, helping them to address current and future needs. The first program in this series focused on Selihot and was presented by Cantor Rena Shapiro of Beth Samuel Jewish Center in Ambridge. The second program featured Rabbi Lenny Sarko of Greensburg's presentation on the Hebrew Braille Sefer Torah that he wrote. The third program, presented by Rabbi Irv Brandwein of Beth Shalom Congregation in Johnstown, focused on the significance of the Golden Calf story. After today, we will have one more program, Conversion to Judaism, Different Eras, Different View by Cantor Michal Gray Schaefer, Congregation B'nai Abraham in Butler. We hope you will attend and encourage your friends to join you on this Zoom program in the series on June 10th at 7 p.m. We will be sending the flyer out shortly. A few logistical details. The program is being recorded. It will be saved on the JCLP YouTube channel. Rabbi Gottlieb encourages people to ask questions during his presentation. If you ask a question, please keep it brief. You can also post questions or comments in the chat room. We will relay them to the rabbi for his response. We thank you for joining us and look forward to a very interesting program. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our rabbi, Bruce Gottlieb. He's been a rabbi since 1983 and a master's of social work therapist since 2000. His diverse background, counseling prisoners as well as parishioners, leads to interesting perspective, and he often presents analogies that are challenging to we, the participants. Rabbi Bruce has come to Sons of Israel and DuBois from Cleveland, Ohio for the past 13 years and loves a good discussion. Rabbi Bruce Gottlieb.
Thanks, Laurel. Folks, if you're going to ask questions, I'm going to ask that you put them into the chat box, and then Laurel, if you would kind of keep an eye on that, please. I'd appreciate that. We're going to break this down. First, I apologize. I am getting over being sick. And so I'm going to do the best I can here. I think we'll be good. We're going to break this down into 3 different sections. The first is going to be a little bit more didactic, talking about the topic and some of the complexities of the topic of interpretation of Torah. And then we're going to apply some of what we learn to one of the most important stories in the Torah, and we're going to pull it apart. We're going to do our own interpretation of it, and then at the end have kind of a more open, free-for-all kind of discussion. So the word PaRDeS refers in this context to the varieties of approaches to biblical exegesis in Rabbinic Judaism, or the interpretation of text in Torah study. You may have noticed in the flyer that the word PaRDeS, the consonants were all uppercase and the vowels were lowercase. And that's because the consonants are an acronym that are formed from the initials of the 4 approaches we're going to be looking at. The first is pshat, the simple. It's the first surface, it's the straight, it's kind of the literal or direct meaning of the text. The second in Hebrew is remez, and these are the hints or the allegorical or hidden or symbolic meanings beyond the literal sense. The third is drash, which comes from the Hebrew word to inquire or to seek. This is the homiletical, the comparative midrashic meaning, if you will, that's given through similar occurrences. This, by and large, is what the stuff of sermons are made of. And then the third, which is the most challenging of all, is sod. And these are the secrets. This is the mysterious esoteric, mystical meaning that has to be achieved through inspiration or revelation. Each type of these interpretations examines an extended meaning of the text. The text says what it says, but then to understand it, we have to extend it. This is no different than in many other areas. So for American jurisprudence, we have the Constitution. That is the text. And then we have other laws, both legislated and case laws, that extend the meaning of the text. They don't contradict it, but they extend it. The pshat, that first plain contextual meaning of the text, we're identifying what's there. Remez, the allegorical meaning, that is, what is the text hinting at that isn't just quite there? Drosh, the metaphorical meaning. Sod represents the hidden meaning. And there is a lot of overlap between these four different types of exploration of the text. Okay, so a couple of definitions first. First, we'll be using the words esoteric and exoteric. ES, esoteric, EX. Exoteric reflects the notion that there is a divine identity that is outside of and different from human identity. The prefix X means out. Esoteric, those notions claim that the divine is to be discovered within human identity. So exoteric, it's outside of us. Esoteric, it is inside of us. Next two words, exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is a legitimate interpretation. We'll come back to the word legitimate in a moment. It's a legitimate interpretation which reads out of the text what the author or authors intended to convey. Eisegesis, on the other hand, reads things into the text. And when we read into the text, undoubtedly, we're reading into the text what the interpreter wishes to find or thinks that he finds there. It expresses the reader's own subjective ideas and not the meaning of the text. So I was thinking how to illustrate this. Let's imagine that we're driving down the street and our best friend passes us in their car. We recognize the best friend's car, we honk, we wave, and there is absolutely no response. So if I'm taking an eisegetical approach, if I'm reading into it, what I'm going to say is, this is really not a faithful friend. How could this person ignore me? If I'm taking an exegetical approach, if I'm reading out of the situation, then I have to acknowledge that we were driving in opposite directions on the interstate. Okay, and so depending on the approach that we take, whether it's exegetical or eisegetical, we are likely to get two completely different interpretations. The last word, hermeneutic. Laurel knows is one of my favorite words in the world. Hermeneutic is the study and establishment of the principles by which something is to be interpreted. That is, it's a philosophy of interpretation. And so that comes back to what I said a minute ago, that exegesis is a legitimate interpretation. All interpretation has to happen within a certain hermeneutic, within a certain philosophy of interpretation. It's like so many other things that it's a philosophy that's hard to define, but we can recognize it when we see it. The example I always use for this is that in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah refers to the suffering servant. Okay? Well, if I'm Jewish, the suffering servant can refer only to the people of Israel. If I am Christian, the suffering servant can refer only to Jesus. Okay, which is the correct interpretation? And the answer is both are correct, depending on whether we're working from a Jewish hermeneutic or a Christian hermeneutic. The important thing here, though, is that interpretation has rules, it has limits, it is not a free-for-all. There's an additional assumption that we make as rabbis in interpreting the text, that in the Torah, there is nothing redundant, there's nothing superfluous, there's nothing without intent. If something looks that way, it's because we do not understand it. If we say a problem in the text, the problem, in fact, is not in the text. The problem is with us. Going to talk about sod here for a minute, and then we'll go back to a little bit more basic stuff and get warmed up, if you will. When we talk about sod, the exoteric reading of scripture, define the words before, is read in the context of the physical world. And so this exoteric interpretation is really the world of the pshat, the simple, the remez, the hidden, and the drush, the homiletic orientations. And this is what we see in the mainstream rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, the Midrash, and most of the Jewish commentaries. The esoteric means that the surface meaning of the scripture is not the real truth to which the text refers. Instead, the surface meaning conceals the real meaning. It doesn't mean what we think it means. It means something that is much deeper, that is hidden, hence sod. The fourth level of exegesis, the sod level, belongs to the hidden interpretations of the text that we find in the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, and in certain areas of Jewish philosophy, most commonly metaphysics. What's important here, though, is that even the sod level, the steep level, does not deny the legitimacy of the other three levels. Okay, so we're going to look at some examples of each of these, and let me okay, and we are going to look at the very first verse of the Bible. Okay. This translation here is a really, really good translation. I'm going to ask that you ignore it. Okay. Oops. Okay. So we're going to pull this apart because we need to pull it apart to understand some of the comments. Okay. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Pay attention that there are 7 words here. We're going to come back to that later. The first word, Hebrew is built on a system of roots. And so the root for this first word is Resh Aleph Shin, which means the beginning or the head, hence Rosh Hashanah. The Tav here is what defines the particular noun form. And this bait is a prefix that means either in or on. Okay. Bara, create, it's past tense. Elohim is one of the names of God. In Judaism and in all of our literature, there are 72 different names for God. Pay attention to this aleph. It's going to come into play a little later. Often in situations where we cannot, excuse me, where it would be inappropriate for us to write God's name, sometimes God's name will be identified or abbreviated with an aleph with a slash mark that looks a little bit like an apostrophe. This fourth word, 8, is a preposition that has no English equivalent. And so there's no translation for it, but effectively what it does is it takes the action of the verb, in this case, bara, created, and channels it to, excuse me, to the object, okay? So in this case, the object is shemayim, heavens, is always in the plural. The hey here is a prefix meaning the. The 8, the same preposition, the vav is a prefix meaning and. Aretz is the land, and again, this prefix hey meaning the. Okay. Now, the reason I want you to ignore this translation is because we're going to start with a very common and very ancient translation, which is, of course, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. We have an 11th century French rabbi. His name is Rashi. He is arguably the most important rabbi when it comes to biblical interpretation. He is unarguably the rabbi that we always turn to first. Okay, so Rashi, in making a pshat, in making the simple, clarifying kind of exploration, says this: if you come to interpret it according to its pshat, interpret it this way: in the beginning of God's creation of heavens and earth. So Rashi adds one word of that fundamentally changes the way we understand this, because if we understand it as in the beginning God created, then we might assume that God created after 7 days, creation is over. If we accept Rashi's interpretation, then we have to recognize creation is an ongoing kind of process. This is not a small thing. A side note here: Rashi not only is important for Jewish studies, Rashi is very important for scholars of French. And the reason is that there are times when Rashi would think that a Hebrew word just needed to be translated to be understood. He's French. He would translate it into French. He lived 1,000 years ago. There are many words of Old French that would be lost, except for the fact that Rashi uses them to translate the Hebrew text. And so because we know what the Hebrew means, we can now kind of reverse engineer what the French means. And again, words that we would not have, except that Rashi did what he did to help us understand our text. So now, coming back, so Rashi's interpretation of this in the beginning of God's creation is a pshat. It's a simple surface kind of meaning. Now, a remez interpretation, a hint. Now, for this, we're going to turn to an 18th century Polish-Lithuanian rabbi by the name of the Vilna Gaon. And the Vilna Gaon tells us that all of the 613 commandments are hinted at in some way or another by this one word of Breshit. And he gives us an example, a really easy example. There is a ceremony called Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. Going back to the Torah, the firstborn child that is a son, it's not the firstborn son, it's the firstborn child that happens to be a son, is dedicated to temple service. And there is a vehicle by which we as parents can buy back our sons from the priestly class, and that ceremony is called Pidyon Haben. So Vilna Gaon says that this commandment of being able to redeem our sons from this service is hinted at by the phrase in Hebrew, Ben Rishon Achrei Shloshim Yom Tifdeh. A first son after 30 days should be redeemed. Well, that phrase is an acronym of this word Bereshit, Ben Rishon Achrei Shloshim Yom Tifdeh. And so in this one word, this one commandment and the other 612 can be interpreted. Now, another example of this remez, of this hint, comes to us from eschatology. Eschatology is the part of theology that deals with death, judgment, final destiny of soul and humankind. We're taught that by the year 2000, the Mashiach will come. Okay? And if Mashiach doesn't come early because we've earned it one way or another, Mashiach's going to come in the year 6000. Now, just in case you're concerned, that gives us about 215 years, give or take. So we should be okay. But we're taught that the year 6000 relates to the 6 days of creation, followed by Shabbat. Well, it happens that this Messianic era is going to be a 1,000-year Messianic era. So what do we have? We have 6 days in Shabbat. We have 6,000 years before the Messianic era and 1,000 years of the Messianic era. And we'll come back to this in a second. But if you look at these 7 words, 6 of them contain an aleph. Only one, Hashemayim, the heavens, does not. So this whole idea of 6,000 years and then 1,000 years is hinted at in this verse. Okay, 7 words, each one with an aleph except Hashemayim. In Jewish gematria, with Jewish numerology, the letter aleph, being the first letter of the alphabet, has a value of 1. Okay, so aleph also hints at a number of variants. Okay, aluf is a chief or a ruler. Okay, one head, in our case, one God. And the word Eleph, also a variant of the same word, is 1. It happens to be 1,000. So here's the way it goes. Of the 6 words that contain an aleph, the first 2, the aleph is in the 3rd position, telling us that this is a period, the first 2,000 years, in which God was hidden. In the second 2 words, it is the first letter representing a period in which God was revealed. And then the last 2 words, the aleph is the second letter. It's the balance. God is both revealed and hidden. Okay? So when was God hidden? God was hidden in the years from creation up to Abraham. When was revelation? From Abraham through the times of the temples, the rabbinic explorations that result in our sacred texts, and now this last 2,000 years of us struggling with that balance between the concealed and the revealed gods. Now, a homiletical interpretation. We're going to go back to Rashi for this. this word reshit, without debate, this word reshit, first, can refer to a number of different things. And elsewhere in our tradition, the word reshit is used to refer to the Torah. It's also used to refer to Jewish people. And so Rashi says that Bereshit can also be homiletically understood to mean due to, on account of the first. That is, on account of the Torah, on account of Jewish people. And so if we look at it from this perspective, creation didn't happen purposelessly, but creation happened for the sake of Torah, for the sake of Jewish people. Now, let's go back to Gematria, another homiletical interpretation. The Torah contains 613 mitzvot. In Deuteronomy, we're told that Moses commanded us the Torah. Okay? Torah is, if we do the gematria on it, the numeric equivalent of the word Torah is 611. 611, but we have 613 commandments. Well, it happens that the first two of the 10 were not communicated to us by Moses. Those are the only two of the commandments that are written in the first person singular. And so we know that God spoke those directly to us. So we have the Torah commanded by Moses, 611, the two commanded by God, we have 613. All of this and a whole lot more out of this one particular verse in the Torah. Now, we're going to touch on Sod here a little bit. It is a little denser, and the rabbis are in some ways not kind to us about it. Maimonides is the other arguably most important rabbi, was a very important person, not only in Jewish life, but also in secular life in 12th century Spain. His seminal work is something called Guide for the Perplexed. And in Guide for the Perplexed, he declares very straightforwardly his intention to conceal from us, the average reader, his explanations. Later on in the book, he mentions divine secrets within the Torah, but doesn't tell us what they are. So one of the things we read is this. Adam and Eve were at first created as one being, having their backs united. They were then separated, and one half was removed and brought before Adam as Eve. Note how clearly it has been stated that Adam and Eve were two in some respects, and yet they remained one according to the words, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This is a verse in the 2nd chapter of Genesis. The unity of the two, Maimonides continues, is proved by the fact that they both have the same name, for she is called Isha, woman, because she was taken out of Ish, man. So Ish and Isha, man and woman, are the same word, just masculine and feminine forms. Okay? And then Maimonides continues, and also by the words, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And then this is where Maimonides gets a little snarky. He says, how great is the ignorance of those who do not see that all this necessarily includes some other idea beside the literal meaning of the words. So Maimonides says, look, we have these things that we have to take note of. And boy, are you guys stupid if you don't already know what it is that I'm talking about, if you don't understand. And we find that kind of statement in the mystical literature, not just from Maimonides, but from his colleagues as well. We find this kind of statement repeatedly. So we have this PaRDeS system. Remember I said that the way it was presented in the flyer with all the consonants capitalized was because that's how we identify, that's the mnemonic for what are the 4 different levels. But the word PaRDeS is also chosen very deliberately. PaRDeS means in Hebrew, means an orchard. And in the entire Bible, the word PaRDeS occurs only 3 times. In the first of these, it means a garden. And in the second and third, it means a park. In the Talmud, it's used for the garden, which is the Garden of Eden, which is, of course, PaRDeS. It is paradise. It's the same word. Now, PaRDeS does not represent the totality of Jewish biblical interpretive approaches. There are many others, and we could go and list them all. What's nice about the PaRDeS system, if you will, is that it does work consistently with any other way that we want to interpret the text, whether it's intellectually, historically, scientifically, from a form critical or source analysis, literary criticism, it doesn't matter. It is also noteworthy that there are similar 4-tier ways of interpreting text that we find in Islam and Christianity. So, as promised, we're going to turn to a different story in a second to do some interpretation ourselves, but have to understand some of the rules. Remember what we said, that we have this assumption that nothing is redundant, nothing is superfluous. Everything that is there for a reason. And if anything looks weird, it's because we don't understand it. The problem is with us. The problem is not with the text. This is now where we come back to Rashi. When we're studying text, when we identify something that doesn't look right, what we ask is, Ma kashel Rashi? What is it here that is difficult for Rashi? That is, what is the perceived problem? So, are there any, before we turn to that, are there any questions?
Rabbi, there don't appear to be any in the chat room right now.
Okay, terrific. So here we have one of what is homiletically the favorite stories in the entire Bible. It's the story of the binding of Isaac. And there's a lot of stuff here that is very interesting and that Rashi does find very challenging. The translations here are very good, but we need to stick to a more literal understanding of the words. Okay, so here we have the first verse. Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'ele. And it was, after these devarim. Now, devarim can mean words or it can mean things, okay? So it happened after these words or after these things that God tested Abraham, Vayomer Elav, and he, that is God, said to him, Avraham, Vayomer, and Abraham responded, Hineni. Okay, so is there anything here? Now, this is the part of the program where you all have to become a little bit more active, and I cannot see you. because I can't see my screen if I maximize my Zoom window. So I'm going to have to rely on everybody else. But the question here is, Ma kashel Rashi. Rashi has a couple of problems here. Any thoughts? So there are two problems here. One is, it happened after these things or these words. What things? What words? Okay. We don't know. Okay. The Elohim nisa et Avraham, and God tested Abraham. What was the purpose of the test? We don't know that either. So, okay. Hang tight with me for 1 second. Okay, I'm going to have to do this differently. Hang tight with me for 1 second here, folks. I can get this in a way that I can use it more easily. Okay, so so what Rashi says is over here, after these things, what things? Well, some of our rabbis say, now Sanhedrin 89b, that is the page number from the tractate in Talmud called Sanhedrin. So Rashi is quoting other rabbis. He does this a lot. Okay, Rashi says that some of our rabbis say that this means that after the words of Satan, who denounced Abraham, say, now, Satan is not the devil. Satan is an angel who serves the role, if you will, as God's foil or God's prosecuting attorney. And they're always at odds with one another. And so the rabbis say that Satan and God were talking one day, and Satan denounced Abraham and said to God, Abraham prepared all these banquets and whatnot for other people. We'll come back to that in a second, but has not offered a single sacrifice to you. And God replied, does he do anything at all except for his son's sake? Okay. Yet, if I were to bid him sacrifice him to me, he would not refuse. Now, we see exactly the same conversation between Satan and God at the beginning of the commentaries on the book of Job. Okay. And so this is one interpretation. Others say that it means after the words of Ishmael. Okay? Remember that Ishmael was 13 years old when God issued the commandment that the boys be circumcised. Okay, so Ishmael boasted to Isaac that he'd been circumcised when he was 13 years old without resisting. Isaac replied to him, "You think to intimidate me by mentioning the loss of one part of your body. If the Holy One, blessed be he, were to tell me, sacrifice yourself to me, I would not refuse." And so Rashi is offering us two different explanations, one that puts Abraham's choice to sacrifice at the heart of this, and one that hold on here 1 second, please. I will be there in just a second. So one that puts there we go. Okay, so one that puts Abraham in place as the subject of the text, one that actually puts Isaac in place as the subject of the text. And I actually have a completely different idea. My idea is that what happened before this was a initially difficult, but in the end very amicable discussion and compromise between Avimelech, who was a king where Abraham was residing at the time, and on account of an incident where Avimelech's men blocked up a well that Abraham had dug. Okay, now wells are not only important for the water they give, but wells are also a way that we stake out territory. And the two of them were able to come to an agreement. And if we look at that and we look at every other story prior to that, where we see the way Abraham interacts with other people, one of the things we see is that Abraham does a great job when we're dealing with strangers. Okay? He argues with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham was circumcised and the next day jumped up out of bed to make a feast for these three strangers that were visiting that turned out to be angels and others. Every story we have about Abraham up to this point, he's a horrible family man. He kicks Ishmael and Hagar out of the house because that's what Sarah wants him to do. They're going to go to Egypt, and Abraham is concerned that the Egyptians will find Sarah very attractive and that they'll kill him so that they can have her. So what does Abe tell Sarah to do? He says, we're going to tell them that you're my sister. So this way, if they take you, at least they won't kill me. And so what I think is that what these things before were all these stories about how Abraham interacts with other people. And therefore, the test becomes a test of whether or not Abraham is going to stand up for his son. Now, why does this matter? God doesn't lie. And God promised Abraham that his descendants would be reckoned through Isaac. And so if God wants Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, then God all of a sudden is breaking a promise he had made. That's not possible. And so to my mind, the only way then that this test can be a test is God's expectation or God's hope that Abraham would have said no. Now, there are a couple of things we just did here. Okay, one is pshat. What does this mean? Okay, what's the simple explanation here? And here, then we get to drush. Okay, what did God want? God wanted Abraham to say no. That was the test. That's a homiletical interpretation. They work together. Now,
it's so important for people to understand that, we all stuff up and do things wrong all day long.
somebody
we've
has
got
a
a-
radio on.
Yeah,
Somebody has
Rabbi, yeah, if people could mute themselves, we would appreciate it. We're getting some
It
background.
goes back a very long ways, you see. Hidden Brain is a show that's primarily about science, but I can't help but make the connection with the origins of Buddhism, according to the story.
Yeah, Michael Klausner, I think it's coming from yours. If you could mute yourself, please.
And as a result of seeing that, internalize the very idea that we're talking.
Okay, so, and so then Rashi is also very interested in this, and because we see this word hineni a lot. Okay, and so Rashi tells us that hineni means here I am, but it's the response to somebody that is pious. It's not it's not a glib, it's not a in school taking, attendance at the beginning of the day. This is the answer of somebody that is pious, is meek, is ready. And so Abraham is saying, I am ready. Okay, whatever you want me to do, I am here, I am ready. I think we have, we're scheduled till 2:00. Okay, so it's 5 minutes to 2. There is a lot more to do here, but we are, there you go. A lot more to do here, but no more time to do. And so we've got, about 5 minutes or so? So any questions, comments, challenges? Because at the end of the day, and Laurel has heard me say this many times, at the end of the day, everything that I said, I could be wrong.
Okay, the chat feature for those of you that want to use it is at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, it's a small group, and if you simply want to unmute yourself, put on the video and flag a question, I'm sure that would be fine too.
Yeah, let's do it that way. Although Laurel, when we're done, there's a request for you in the chat box. Okay. So, questions, comments, arguments. Please, somebody tell me I'm wrong. Laurel's used to that. Irene.
Yeah. I can just go back to your very beginning when you were interpreting the word Bereshit.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a whole world of difference.
Yes.
To everything that I've learned. So I appreciate, and then everything you talked about after that. But I really appreciate that interpretation because that's so much more clear than anything I've ever learned. And I've been around a long time.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems that we face now with the way that we read certain parts of the Bible in throughout the world is that the Septuagint, which was the original Greek translation of the Torah, and the Vulgate, which is the original Latin translation, were not translated very well. They were translated by people that had a limited, deep understanding of Hebrew and the nuances of Hebrew. And so there are a lot of mistakes that crept into those two versions, but it's those two versions that form the basis of most English translations. It's still unheard of in some places that we would dare go back to the Hebrew to understand what the Bible is telling us.
Mhm.
But that first verse, even understanding the Hebrew, is tricky, and we need Rashi's comment to give us that direction.
Also, I thought it was interesting, and I was not aware that he was French and he translated it into French, and then we went from there. I never knew that. So that was also very informative.
Yeah, so he did not translate the Torah into French.
Oh,
Okay. There are places in his commentary where he will translate a word or a phrase into French because he wanted to explain it. He wanted to make it most accessible to his audience.
okay. Thank you.
Rabbi, the fact that Rashi's interpretation looks to an ongoing explanation for creation, that it's not simply static. Was that part of his overall philosophy and how he looked at the world and our role in it as potential partners in creation, or am I reading too much into that?
I don't know, because I don't know enough about Rashi's worldview, but it's reasonable to say yes. Rashi's interpretation also is kind of at the core of the entire Jewish ecological movement. That this idea that creation is ongoing. Anything else? So my Penn State clock on the wall, I am a proud alum. And Laurel did not mention, well, this is a Western Pennsylvania group. It may not be safe for me that I did grow up in the great state of Philadelphia. But my Penn State clock says that it is 2 o'clock. Steve, I will turn it over to you. Or Laurel, I'm sorry.
Yes, that's okay. You said there was something in the chat box for me and I cannot find anything. So I'm not sure what you were wanting of me with that.
So Emily asked if you could add her to our mailing list.
Oh, okay. I'm sure that we can do that.
I will send you out in the chat. I'll send you my address.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, then I'd like to thank Rabbi Gottlieb for our interesting presentation. And I would like to, we already did that. And it concludes today's program. Thanks to Rabbi Gottlieb and to all of you who attended. We look forward to seeing you in June at our final program presented by Cantor Gray Schaefer.
Laurel, you the chat's been disabled. So if you want to just stay on here for a minute, I can give you my information.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi. Good job. I enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.
Very much. Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks
Thank
a lot. Thank you, Laurel.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Laurel, you have hosting privileges, right?
I think Steve does, but we'll take care of it.
Okay.
I'll stay on until you go up.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't want to leave and crash the thing, so.
Okay.
Alrighty, take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Bruce. We'll see you soon.
Uh-huh.
Laurel, was Emily? Oh, there she is.
I'm
Hi.
here.
Okay, hi. Ellen.
Hi. So my last name is Brent, Brent,
Mhm.
and my mailing address is 314 Ridgewood Road,
Okay,
and that's in Shippenville. And the zip code is 16254.
4. And how about email?
EMMY_1296 at Yahoo.
At Yahoo. Okay. Okay, wonderful.
Thank
Thank you, Emily. Oh,
All right.
of course.
Have a good day.
Okay, you too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I when I went to try to get on the chat, it also said disabled, so I don't know.
I had it open.
Huh?
Thank you, Laurel, and thank you, Steve, so much.
Hey, Noah.
I'm in the airport in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So fortunately, I was able to listen to the rabbi. So thank you so much.
Oh, good. Okay.
Laurel,
Thank
we
you.
still have a couple others on the call. Joyce, Arlene, anything you want to share or help
Okay.
us with?
I'm from B'nai Abraham and Butler. And that was so scholarly today. I learned so much.
Well, good.
Thank you.
We're glad you could be here.
I'm so thankful for the series. Yes.
Arlene Sandelstein, anything for us?
Evidently not. You have safe travels, Noah.
Well, thank you. Thank you again. And we will touch base soon for the next one.
Okay, great.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, Steve, thanks again.
My,
Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye, Laurel.
Bye. Take
Thanks.
care.
then,
Mhm.
Chag Sameach.
Shemaya.